Hi, my name is Brady Deaton, and I'm a professor in the Department of Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph. And today I'm going to be talking about ownership matters. I'm going to be talking about matters in the sense of a lot of issues, but I'm also going to be emphasizing the idea that ownership matters. Before I get into the substance of my presentation, let me just say that ownership can vary in all sorts of ways. It can vary with respect to who owns land. So you might think of classic examples including state ownership of land or private ownership of land or a common property where a collection of people might own land. It can importantly vary by someone's strength in property rights. And by property rights, I mean the capacity of an individual or a person or a group to call upon the collective to enforce their claim to use land in a particular way. And this can vary considerably. In some places of the world, people have a great deal of certainty or a probability of one that they'll be able to use the land the way they expect to use the land. But in other areas of the world, people are less certain that they will have the right to use the land the way they expect to. And in these situations, property isn't as strong, and it has tremendous implications for economic outcomes like willingness to invest in land that you may not be certain that you'll be able to use in the future. And the third area is that land ownership can vary considerably with respect to the portfolio of rights one may be able to exercise with respect to a particular parcel. So in some areas of Canada, farmers may expect to be able to develop their land at some future point for a non-agriculture use, whereas in other areas, which we'll talk about, they may not have that same expectation because they may be disallowed to use land in certain ways, and these issues matter. There's three important themes. And the first theme is I'm going to emphasize the importance of ownership matters to our history, but also to the history of the economics profession. The second area that I'm going to emphasize is the importance of ownership matters to understanding economic relations, the interactions with respect to institutions between people, between organizations, between societies. These interactions and their effects on who wins and who loses with respect to the exercise of power, that's broadly what I speak about when I use the term economic relations. And the third is I'm going to focus on a range of contemporary issues that I've studied and emphasize the importance of these ownership matters to the moment that we're in. And I'll break it up just to anticipate where I'm going. I'll talk a little bit about why I'm so passionate about this area with respect to my own history. And then I'll talk collectively about our own history in this area. And then I'll focus on contemporary issues of importance. So let's move to my history. And I'll just emphasize one part of that. When I was a child growing up in the Tennessee area and visiting my grandparents in Kentucky, we would drive through the Appalachian Mountains and we would see scenes like the one that you're looking at here where the scarring of the mountains had occurred, and we would ask my parents questions about what was going on. And this particular scene reflects what's often referred to as a coal extraction process of mountain removal, which means essentially you're going to move portions of the mountain in order to get easy access to the coal seam. And this captured a number of ideas which would be important to me my whole life and when I considered what was going on. Some of those ideas are to recognize that land and land use issues are almost always local. Here's an example of coal production, which was important to all of the United States and even internationally. And I could see that some aspects of that production, the aesthetics, the environmental effects, were experienced very local. So land is an important issue, and the ownership surrounding land is an important issue always locally, in part because land ownership always occupies space uniquely. And the second was that there was an important relationship between how land was used and property. Now, throughout this region, the use of the broad form deed allowed individuals and coal companies the capacity to purchase land that, in a way that severed the mineral rights, the subsurface rights, from the surface rights, and allowed them expansive power in getting to those mineral rights in ways that are reflected in this picture. And third, and this is often an important aspect of land issues and land controversy, is that there are winners and losers associated with these types of land use and land use issues. And there's often the exercise of power where one group is able to make their vision of the future matter more than another. So that was the history that I brought. And what I found throughout my entire life is that these issues are deeply embedded in our history, almost from the beginning. I want to take a minute now and review our history and emphasizing the importance of economic relations. Let me just step back and say, in the origin stories, in a variety of different cultures, land is a paramount consideration. In the Judeo-Christian origin story, in the beginning, God creates the earth. And in later chapters of the Bible, like Leviticus, ownership matters matter and feature prominently. Who can own the land, when the land should be left fallow, on and on. And this story is also critical for indigenous peoples. Now, those are oral traditions, and those stories vary by different communities. But in some stories, for example, the sky woman is falling from the heavens, and as she falls towards what we now think about as the earth, the creatures of the earth come together and form land on a turtle's back. And this establishes a very sacred relationship between the animals and the land. And indeed, in a sense, it's these two stories that in part come together in the 15th century and form an understanding of the colonial indigenous history that's so important to our contemporary setting. And indeed, the conflict of land ownership is still prevalent in many ways today. Controversies around issues that are important, like sovereignty, issues that are creeping up in our present day situation where there's tension between the United States and Canada with respect to the sovereignty of the country. And to understand the centrality of economic relationships and ownership, I want you to reflect on this picture. This is a picture that one of my dissertation co-advisors used to use in his introductory institutional economics class to get people to reflect on the importance of institutions. And the question he would ask, and the question that I'm asking you, is what is going on? If you take a second and look at the picture, your conclusion would likely be, though you might understand aspects of the painting, I don't know. Now, this is a painting that was made by Charles Russell in the early 20th century, and you can clearly see that it depicts an interaction between an indigenous horseman and a cattleman moving cattle across the range. But if I told you the title of the painting, you could begin to put together its meaning. The title of the painting is called The Toll Collectors. And one then can start to see that in the painting, the indigenous horseman is signaling to the cattleman that he's collecting a toll for the right to move cattle across their property. Once you understand this ownership matter, you can really understand the economic relation, the relationship between two groups of people, two societies. And you can start to understand the transaction and the real meaning of the word, the transformation of ownership of things or animals between two different groups of people. This painting helps me focus you or our attention on the importance and the relationship between economic relations and ownership. Now, I want to speak to the history of the economics profession. This has been well understood by economists almost from the beginning. I could have started with the physiocrats, but I'll start with Adam Smith in 1776, who starts his focus in areas of economics with three critical factors of production: land, capital, and labor. And stories are prevalent throughout the wealth of nations about land owners lobbying the government to achieve certain outcomes that increase the price of, say, commodities so as to increase their return. For example, in one portion of the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith is talking about landowners lobbying government to disallow the development of road infrastructure to the hinterland because they fear the competition of farm products moving in and thereby lowering their price. So these issues of economic relations and the importance of ownership run through all of classical economics. And Adam Smith would have been no stranger to the issues that were raised by one of the recent Nobel Prize winner, Daron Acemoglu, in his Nobel Prize address, where he focuses on the importance of economic institutions, political institutions, and the exercise of power and how they influence the rules of the game. So throughout the history of the economics profession, issues of ownership and property rights have been central considerations. What might have surprised Adam Smith would have been the unique methods of causality that the recent Nobel, that Daron Acemoglu was using to understand what was going on and why some countries prosper and others do not. And we can see very early on in the Economics Association meetings, issues of ownership were being discussed and of importance. Here you have a session that was put together in 1897 exploring the issue of land renting and its effect on the agriculture sector. And this is in 1897. One shouldn't be surprised, given that 40% of the farmland in both roughly in Canada and the United States are in the rental market, and most of that is not owned by people who are actively farming. One wouldn't be surprised to hear a session like this presently. And I would be remiss if I didn't focus on this issue in the context of the beginning of the agriculture economics profession. This is a picture of Ag Hall at the University of Wisconsin, which was the first department of agriculture economics. And I would just say that the first chair of the first department of agriculture economics, Henry Taylor, wrote his dissertation on the disappearance of the farmer-owned farmland, farmer owner of farmland in England. So with this historic backdrop in mind, I want to now focus on some of the contemporary implications of land ownership and economic relations. And I want to return back to this issue of who owns the land, one aspect of ownership that I mentioned early. So on your right, you see Bill Gates, and that's a face that's probably very familiar to you. And on the left, a person you might not be as familiar with is Robert Angelic, who is the largest owner of farmland in Canada. What these two people also have in common is that they are unlikely the intended beneficiaries of government policy, but they are. It's straightforward logic that if government programs designed to support agriculture increase the expected returns through perhaps increased rental rates, that is likely to transform itself into higher land values. And the beneficiaries of those are landlords. This is not an idea, going back to Adam Smith and the classics, that would be surprising. What's interesting in the contemporary setting of research is trying to understand just how much the benefit from those subsidies they receive. Adam Smith wouldn't have been surprised by this, and Andy Schmitz wasn't surprised by this. And he argued in one of his classic textbooks that this was a major stumbling block to agriculture policy, because agriculture policy was primarily designed to support producers, but given that 40% of the farmland is owned by non-farmers, many of them who aren't making day-to-day decisions about farming like a producer might, that this would be an ongoing challenge. And it is. In a recent review article that my colleague Chad Lawley and I looked at, we reviewed a great deal of literature on just how much of the marginal subsidy dollar was being captured by farmland owners. And it turns out, interestingly, in both the United States and Canada, there are very different estimates of just how much of the marginal dollar gets capitalized into land values. Some estimates might be about 25 cents and other estimates being much, much higher. And in this particular case, the magnitude really matters. So hat tip to other people researching in this area. This is an area that is deserving of ongoing exploration, but also important to understand this relationship between government and landlords, and that important aspect of the economic relations that we were speaking to earlier in the presentation. Now, this issue, I believe, is important for other reasons, particularly in a world where we're looking at the agriculture sector and we're hoping that it will continue to adapt in all sorts of important ways. We expect it to adapt, to continue to deliver food to people, both within the countries where we live and throughout the world, and we expect it to adapt to all sorts of challenges like climate change. And given the fact that a large portion of the farmland is owned by non-farmers, my colleague and I were interested in understanding how farmers behaved on land that they owned, and was it similar to land that they rented in. And what we found, and this was particularly with respect to cover crops, is that farmers act similar when they have long-term expectations to be on the land. So if it was greater than 5 years, farmers would treat the land that they rented in very similar to the land that they owned. So this length of time is an important determination in the character of conservation practices that farmers will establish on land that they're renting in. And in particular, an interesting issue that came from our study of this area is that landlords feel there are some things that they completely turn over to their tenant or to the farmer. For example, when to plant, when to till the land. Those are things that our landlords view as being central and left in the realm of the producer. But a much larger percentage of landlords, roughly around 30% in one of the studies we review, indicate that it's important, it's on the landlord to determine conservation practices. And I think this is a really important point, because moving forward in the adaptive process, it will be important for policymakers to provide information and incentives not only to farmers and producers for how they're going to use the land, but to recognize that landlord decisions are also an important feature of the dynamic process that will govern the adaptive process moving forward in the agriculture sector. Now I want to move to a second contemporary issue that's very important, and that's intestate succession. So if you die without a will, the state has one for you. And we know that low-income people are more likely to die without a will. And we also know that low-income households are not evenly distributed spatially, that they're clustered in particular areas. So these laws of intestacy are more likely to influence pockets, particularly pockets of poverty, where people own real property. That's houses and things affixed to land. Now, where I've focused my research in Kentucky, this form of inheritance has a particular form that influences not only the relationships between owners in profound ways, but I think also influences economic outcomes and are important ways to consider. So I'll give an example of how these intestate laws work just to build the intuition. So the simplest example I can think of is imagine an individual owning property who is survived by 3 children, but doesn't make a will. Each one of those children would inherit a 1/3 partial interest to the whole of the land. Importantly, the land isn't divided in this form of ownership, but each one of them is able to use the land, the whole of the land, subject to the rights of the other co-tenants. And this requires that for many uses of the land, say for like timbering the land, that you have to coordinate with each other. And just to move the example, suppose that, say, one of those siblings, those initial 3 siblings, one of those siblings were to die, and they were survived by 2 children. All of a sudden there would be 4 owners of the plot, and each one of those would be able to exercise a right to the whole. Now, I don't know about you, but when I get together with my siblings and cousins, it's very, very difficult to even pick a place to go to eat. So focusing on the economic relations that might emerge surrounding the use of land is very, very important. And intestate succession shows a relationship between institutions and individual and ownership relationships that matter in all sorts of ways, particularly for economic outcomes, like getting a mortgage on their land. Individuals in this setting would have to all coordinate with each other in order to use their land in a way that would allow them to leverage it as a mortgage. So these have profound implications, and I've spent a great deal of my academic life studying them. And in a host of various papers, I've examined the prevalence of this issue in Eastern Kentucky. I've examined the way those economic relations play themselves out. In one angle, there's a wealth concern because the land can't be used as effectively as it might otherwise be used to achieve certain investment outcomes or resource use outcomes. On the other hand, there's a vulnerability that emerges between the co-tenants with respect to how others might use the land or want to use the land. This has continued to remain an important issue, and it's important wherever you are in the world to understand how the laws of intestate succession are actually influencing the economic relations between the people who own the land and influencing important economic outcomes. I want to talk to you now the portfolio of rights we were talking about earlier when we were talking about ownership, how different land can be used for different things, and how that is profoundly important to understanding economic relations. And really quickly, it doesn't matter where you are, at least in North America, zoning, which defines how land can and cannot be used, is an influential part of the economy and the relations between people with respect to land. So here's just a zoning map from New York City, and each of these different colors is influencing how the land can or cannot be used. This could be anywhere. This is a place closer to me, a zoning map from Waterloo, Ontario, and you can see all of the different colors, each of these identifying a zoning bylaw that tells how land can and cannot be used. And these rules or these economic institutions are very important for broader themes. This is a very historic green belt that disallows the use of certain forest and farming areas around London. And it's also important I'm going to spend a little more time talking about the green belt in the Toronto area of Canada. And these green belts in many cases are, in its simplest form, a form of zoning that disallows the use of farmland, which is characterized in this picture as green, for non-agriculture uses, particularly things like residential housing or apartment buildings. And I think what's important to realize is that you have this important intersection then between agriculture issues and urban issues where the majority of people live. So in this area, roughly 40, the picture that you see there, that green and gray area around Toronto, roughly 40% of Ontario, the province of Ontario, live in this area. And roughly 16% of all of Canada lives in this area. So these issues are important. And economics theoretically can be used to examine all sorts of implications. One of those, and the one that I'm going to focus on, is how these zoning laws are perceived to influence prices and how that, in fact, may be experienced differently by different groups. So if you disallow the use of the development or the use of farmland for non-farmland purposes, you might expect that that diminishes, say, the price of farmland in those greenbelt areas that are near urbanizing areas. And indeed, whether it be in Toronto or even other areas that I've examined, you see people reflect this sentiment in their understanding of the relationship between themselves and institutions like zoning. Let me give an example of that. So this is from a study that I was involved in some time back, but here we're asking landowners in Kent County, Michigan, how they feel about restrictions on land in order to preserve farmland. So I believe the first question here is, development restrictions are necessary to preserve farmland. And now this is given to landowners, and the majority of them strongly agree with that sentiment. But if you ask them, would they want the zoning on their land to preserve farmland, you get a radically different answer. It goes from roughly 71% of the people being in agreement and to 22% of the people. And this goes back to something my advisor used to always say when I was in graduate school, is that much depends on whose ox is being gored. And it also helps explain the economic relationships to some extent in the agriculture sector. My own experience is that many, many farmers are in support of the green belt. But anecdotally, when I've talked to farmers who are not, they tend to be the one who the green belt applies to. And you can see all other sorts of issues, economic relations that emerge from this. This is a picture from a magazine that brings us to a really interesting contemporary controversy that just recently happened with respect to changes in the zoning rules. And in this picture, what you see is the teeth of that green belt boundary. On one side, you see a rural bucolic setting, and on the other side you see this densely developed area. And you can understand then the meaning of the economic institutions. But the story that I want to build up is that recently there was a controversy where a group of developers had bought land in that bucolic portion in the green belt with the expressed purpose and the hope that the zoning rules that maintained the land as farmland would be changed and would allow them to develop that land for urban uses. And this is a very important aspect of the issue of ownership matters. That is the want of different people to change the rules of the game, if you will, or those institutions. In the Auditor General, in reviewing this controversy, by the way, these zoning rules ultimately were not changed because of the controversy. The Auditor General estimated that the 15 properties that the people sought to remove from the Greenbelt regulations would have, the removal of that would have led to an increase of value of around $8.3 billion. That's a tremendous sum of money. And it tells you not only something about the way zoning influences values, but it shows you the way that ownership and that those ownership situations, there's incentives to change them. And this also reminds me of a story that my advisor once told me about, and he was speaking informally, but he said, low and middle income people teach their children to follow the rules, but wealthy people teach their children that the rules are variables to be changed for their gain. And I think that's reflected a little bit in the story. And I will say, as a professor and a professor of economics, that I don't know how true that story is, whether it does break up by wealth, but I do know that this idea that there are incentives associated with ownership to change the rules, and that radically influences winners and losers as well as economic relations, that it's incumbent upon institutions of higher education to teach that to all our children. So I want to make some closing thoughts. And in doing so, I want to reflect a little bit of the moment we're in right now. And I want to go in some ways back to the way that history influences the present. I think it was William Faulkner who said the past isn't dead. In fact, it's not even past. And with the issues of ownership and the way they play out in all sorts of ways, that story is very true. They play themselves out. Their historic issues of ownership play themselves out in the present in very important ways. So this is research that I've done with my colleague, Bethany Lipka, for almost a decade, and we've been studying water sharing arrangements between provincial municipalities and First Nations. And we've been studying this issue because there has been, for more than a decade, concern about the quality of drinking water on First Nations. And the question we've been asking is, well, in many places, would it be feasible for municipalities to share water with their drinking water with nearby First Nations by providing the necessary infrastructure? And if so, would that reduce the probability of poor drinking water experiences on First Nations? And the answer to that question is there are many places, as I'll discuss in a minute, where sharing drinking water between municipalities and First Nations would be feasible. And we argue that doing so would reduce the likelihood of drinking water advisories on First Nations. And really, we study a broad area, but this is a microcosm of the storyline that we're concerned about. In this picture, you see blue areas and orange areas. These are all municipalities in Ontario that share water in one way or another, water infrastructure with each other. And so drinking water in one area is in part influenced by its relationship with all of these areas. And these areas, these provinces, these municipalities are all creatures of the province, so they institutionally are structured to work together in a different way than the three First Nation communities that you see in this picture. At the time of our study, none of these areas were involved in sharing water with municipalities, and some of them suffered poor drinking water quality. So the question we were examining was, is it feasible? And clearly you can see in this picture that it would be feasible to run water infrastructure into these areas. And would doing so, well, we can answer the specific question for these particular communities, but as a general finding, we argued that doing so would improve the drinking water quality on these First Nations. And an important question for us to consider is, why don't these water sharing arrangements emerge? And there are many, many factors that go into it. But one factor that's important, and I want to emphasize here, is that the relations between First Nations and non-First Nations or municipalities and province are very much influenced by a long history and different conceptions of the history of ownership and ownership rights, of the rights to governance, and those concerns and understanding of that history continue to influence and challenge the opportunities for cooperative relations. And that's very important because as we stand in the present moment with the President of the United States questioning the sovereignty of Canada, we begin to understand how that sensitivity can influence the capacity of the economic relations, if you will, between societies to enter into cooperative relations. And we can see this in two dimensions. First, we can see it straightforward in what's the relationship for us between two countries where the border or the sovereignty of the border is being threatened with respect of all sorts of exchanges. And here you see a picture with pipelines going north and south. But we can also see it with respect to our own country and the challenge of it. How do we run pipelines from east to west or from west to east? Embedded in that, and one of the well-known challenges to that, is the relationship between First Nations and Indigenous communities and the federal government of Canada. And we're now very much in the modern setting trying to reconcile ourselves through institutions like Duty to Consult, or through, and one interesting development of the last couple of months has been a minority purchase by a number of First Nations in one of these pipelines in order to be invested in it, new forms of ownership, because ownership matters. So moving forward for Canada, for the United States, for relationships between people within and across both countries, an understanding of the history, of the economic relations associated with ownership, and teaching that are going to be ongoing important areas of inquiry. I was happy to share this time with you about my own research, and I look forward to continuing this discussion.